Welcome back to all our listeners. This is What We Can't Not Talk About, the podcast of the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture. I'm Dr. Mariana Orlandi, host of the show, and our guest today is Leah Libresco Sargeant,
Thank
most
you for
recently author. No,
Sorry.
you can go. You can go. I just, if you,
Mhm.
most recently, she was the author of a truly wonderful book, The Dignity of Dependence, a Feminist Manifesto. And so, good evening, Leah, and welcome on our show.
Thank you so much for having me on.
And thank you for saying good evening immediately. I also want to tell, the audience this evening, this is like this bedtime story kind of like setting it looks here. And because Leah is also the mother of 3 children, and at this point they're sleeping. I hope.
Mhm.
Are
Yes,
they?
as far as we know, they are sleeping. And if they're
Okay,
not, they're
that's
being
wonderful.
very quiet and sneaky, which is basically allowed.
Well, thank you for joining us in the evening. And so, what I want to say before we get started and started talking about your book, which I absolutely loved, I want to say that there is really a lot that Leah and I could cover today. And everything that we could cover is extremely relevant with reference to the current culture, the status of the relationship, and good policy. Leah, before writing this book, already published other 2 books, and she's a prolific and very original Substack author. She has a Substack called Other Feminisms, which I highly recommend. And she is an excellent speaker, doesn't have an accent like I do. She's a great thinker, and I love her columns that appeared in all the major outlets. In her latest book, she touches on, I would say, I mean, dozens of topics that are relevant to us, Austin Institute, to our audience, from the underreported side effects of the pill to the dysfunctional design of Social Security income, from the immense and underestimated value of amatorial care, the free care that we provide, as mothers, as spouses, as even daughters, to the need to recognize the anthropological and unescapable and yet good differences between men and women. So we will do what we can, um, and let the conversation flow. And hopefully, Leah, this won't be the last time you join us, be it online or in person.
Absolutely.
So just before we get to the book, and to some of these topics, I have the impression that there is a Leah's personal journey from independence or an illusion of independence to this dignity of dependence that you talk about. And I don't know if this is, if a journey from one to the other is the way you would describe it, but what I read and what I've read in your book and in your article is a story of a very successful student who was the only female in males classes and males groups, and then an atheist columnist and a pro-choice feminist. And so, and I even, your initial reluctance of, not reluctance maybe, but like hesitation in taking your husband's last name. So would you like to start talking about your personal understanding of or growing towards this dignity of dependence?
Sure. I think in some ways each of my 3 books is centered on something I'm bad at, which is the reason I needed to learn enough about it to write about it at book length. My first book is about my conversion from atheism to Catholicism and learning to pray. My second book is about building community. And my third book is about embracing dependence as core to who we are, not a temporary embarrassment from our natural state of autonomy, but who we are from conception to death. And I think, obviously for me and most younger people, that is an awareness you have to grow into or actively embrace, because the younger you are before you have kids, the easier it is to see your life as mostly unfolding according to plans. If your plans is mostly depending on your own strength, which might well be enough to carry you through them. And I think what happens is as we grow older, that we have the experience of our bodies getting away from us, surprising us. But also, more than that, the wider our circle of love, the more we will find ourselves loving people whose bodily needs, whose physical frailty upsets our plans or shows us the limits of what we can plan for ourselves, whether that's our parents moving into a period of aging and need, whether it's our children, born in a period of abject dependence. Even after birth, they're no more viable than they were in the womb. They need other people. Or whether it's our friends who go through accidents, diseases, anything that takes away what was the autonomy they thought they'd enjoy for life, and reminds us that even when we are strong, our lives are shaped by weakness.
I just to, just to push back on that, because I wish we all had this reckoning, right? So if life in itself was sufficient to wake us up, we would probably not even need to read your book, right? So now Christians could say it was grace too. But do you think, there were moments or things in particular that made you realize that independence, or maybe a liberal kind of feminism? You help me understand what kind of feminisms are there, because you're an expert on this, and I would like to understand it also, for the men listening, because they get really upset at the use of the word feminism, but maybe they might understand there are good ones too. But so, yeah, maybe how did you understand that there were better ways to be pro woman, if you allow me that expression?
Yeah, obviously, feminism is and has been since its beginning kind of a rowdy scrum around the terms. And everyone has someone they'd like to read out of the movement, and different groups predominate at different times. But the reason I identify with the word feminist and with parts of the tradition is I think it's fundamentally a movement concerned with what it means to be just to women as women, taking seriously that there are asymmetries between men and women, and that the fact that men and women are different does not make women defective men. That's certainly a lot of what my mom passed on to me as a second wave feminist, and a lot of that I'm able to retain and be attached to as a Catholic feminist. What it really depends on is what your view of the human person is. If you start from a false view of the human person, it'll be hard to be just to men or to women. And I think it is that idea of autonomy that's get bound up with both, where we imagine that men do enjoy this form of autonomy that even men don't possess. And then, in order to help women be treated equally or be equivalent, there's a temptation to figure out how you can raise them to the autonomy that men enjoy, particularly around pregnancy, when in fact, autonomy is not a state enjoyed by men at all. It's just that pregnancy isn't what shakes them out of it. And for me, you asked about my personal journey. Certainly, pregnancy was a big part of that for me. You know, my husband and I unfortunately suffered 6 miscarriages. And, it's really a
I'm
big
sorry.
experience, thank you, of learning how little your own plans or desires have to do with what happens to the people you love. And I think it was kind of an especially acute experience of that. But the 3 children we have who made it to delivery aren't really any less fragile than the brothers and sisters we lost. They're hardier, they're bigger. I can see them, I can care for them more directly in certain ways. But I'm not the author of any of my children, and I don't have control over what happens to them. And ultimately, all of us, me, my husband, all of my children, will one day die at a time and place unknown to me. And I have to approach all of my life of love with this essential fragility in mind.
So pregnancy was a big moment. Um,
Absolutely.
and I would say, reading your previous book, I think I would encourage, the listeners to follow also to read what you wrote previously, which I think, as you say, it does feel like a process. The dignity of dependence. So you describe women, and we'll get more to it, but like in summary, women are dependent in a way that is different from the way the men are, but we all are, and we all are interconnected. But at the same time, the subtitle of this book is a feminist manifesto. So, I asked for a friend,
Mhm.
how can dependence be a feminist manifesto? What does that mean?
Absolutely. I would say it's feminist because it's rooted in the truth of what it means to be a human woman. And you can't ultimately construct a strong or accurate or healthful feminism if there are parts of being a woman you're ashamed of or, you know, trying to fix ultimately. And you certainly can't be a Christian feminist. I think Christians always have the duty of saying that there is something good about our embodied nature. You can't kind of retreat to the more transhumanist idea of, well, evolution has given us the best it could over time, but now we're able to author something better. Christians see a divine order in the, you know, nature of our embodied selves in both a cross and a gift. So you've got to be curious. Even when you hit friction, why is my body cyclical? Why does it follow these patterns? What good is there to find amid this? Not, wow, one more bug report about the body that one day we'll find a way to fix. And I think a real robust feminism has space to really delight in the female body. And when we see those bits of friction, where pregnancy in particular isn't well accommodated by our society, we don't, as good feminists, say, wow, women are bad at being in society. How can we fix women? We say, wow, society is not really being just in accommodating women. How do we fix society?
And so let's get this is something I wanted to discuss a little later because I didn't want to become kind of controversial immediately. But because you said something that might trigger some of the men I know that think rightly about men and women, but they do feel that too many of the spaces that in the past belonged to men have been taken up by women. I know you've had a great conversation with Ellen Andrews, and you've touched upon the concept, the great feminization. And I know that our listeners have read that article because I shared it in the past, and I think that the same reaction you had to some of the things that were mentioned in that great feminizations are the one that I mean I relate a lot. Like there was a stress on the vices of women and on a society has been feminized. But I think that that article at the same point and other feminists have acknowledged how a society that has transformed or tried to transform women into men has also deprived men of a lot of the spaces that belong to them. So, what is your when you say, society has not accommodated women, I know what you mean because I've read your book, but would you let our audience know?
Yeah, I'd say society doesn't accommodate women well when it only allows a very narrow range of women, which might be non-pregnant women, non-pregnant strong women who don't have anyone who depends on them who might be disruptive to this space. Where you'll see people say like, "Oh, don't take your kids to the grocery store. They're fussy at the grocery store." There's really the question of, are you thinking I'm hiring a sitter to go buy groceries? That there's a kind of hostility towards, I would say, kind of the high variance people in our society. Children, a particularly strong example. People with disabilities, another. Where the idea is, well, we want a narrow range of people in this space. If you're too far outside it, if you might be too loud, if you might have needs that are different than other people's needs, then that's a you problem, but our space isn't designed for you. And whenever you make a society hostile to children, it's particularly hostile to women, who will, of course, be the ones who most often and for the longest period have their lives shaped by their children's needs. My husband and I both love our kids. We're both perfectly able to take care of our kids, but only I nursed our kids. So there was a very real sense in which I was tethered to them in a different way. Now, I think none of that requires shortchanging men. In the same way that building a ramp to the grocery store doesn't shortchange able-bodied people who are capable of using the stairs. What I think we've lost a lot is a way of speaking frankly and appreciatively about the asymmetries between men and women. That the greater the pressure for women to try and erase the asymmetries for fear of being treated as lesser than, the greater the pressure also for men to not explore the asymmetries and not have single-sex spaces for fear each of them is an invitation to sexism. Now, some of them were invitations to sexism, which I think is the other challenge. I'd like to see more healthy male spaces come back. But the reason there was hostility towards them is sometimes they did operate as a wall to keep women from advancing in a field at all. And striking that balance of men do need spaces of their own and women need to be able to trust that that won't become a way to exclude us from broad parts of society, that's the challenge.
Yeah. I think I so much agree with you. There is a analysis are often right on both, on every side. It's just that the solutions that sometimes get proposed or suggested, or people that talk about the pendulum swinging, that's
Mhm.
always something that scares me because it's never good. It means not having learned anything from why we first went, too far in one direction. Like if at least we started going one way, there probably was a reason. So, and I do see both women and men going in the wrong direction. I was curious about what you thought in particular about a phenomenon that maybe it's even old at this point, but that of the trad wife. And should young men aspire to that? Is that the kind of again, I think I know your answers, but that's my job. I need to ask you questions.
No,
Is that the kind
I think it's a
Yeah.
funny thing to kind of unpack what the word means, right? Because I think there's
Okay.
one bucket of what trad wife means, and it's not one I'm very interested in or I think is very real, that represents something actually out there in the world. And it's kind of the Instagram or TikTok trad wife, where a woman's performance of traditionalism and femininity is not directed particularly at her husband or her children. It's all directed outward, where it's, and I'm sorry to say it this frankly, but I've seen some of the videos, busty young women bending over their cooking and whispering to the camera. That's not trad wifery at all. That's like verging on pinup performance. And no one should really be seeking out something that's essentially aimed at voyeurs in what they want as a spouse. I'd say what's very different are things like the women featured in Catherine Picolick's Hannah's Children, where she's looking at women who have really prioritized family in a big and countercultural way. She's looking at women with college degrees who have had 5 or more kids, and what led them to make that choice. What did the compromises they make look like? So I just think you'll always get a weird sampling frame for what trad wives look like if you're looking online, because someone who's living a vibrant, home-centered life is not extremely online. Now you can go back and forth on whether I'm a trad wife in any way. I've taken my husband's name. I've got 3 kids so far. I wear a chapel veil to Mass when my kids don't pull it off my head. So maybe 10% of Mass I'm wearing it. The rest of the time, my kids are running around with it. Um, I'm faithful to what the Catholic Church teaches, but I also wear pants. So it really depends on what you're describing as your line. And I think it has to be about, if it's something worth preserving, about that essential asymmetry between men and women and how that's honored and how it gives life to a marriage, much more than it's about exact clothes or makeup or what you cook.
So could we say that if a man really wanted, your take is we need to recover the right anthropological view, right? We can't fix anything, and that's what we preach here at the institute, right? We cannot preach marriage if we don't understand man and woman. We need
Yes.
to start. Let's start. Go back. But so let's see. If I am a young man that wants, a real wife, a good wife, the characteristics that I should look for are the ones I think that would make me see her as someone who has accepted her being a woman, right? Her difference. So what does that look like?
I think if I think about some things I've tried to correct in my own life, some of it is about really having your identity as a woman rooted in something that isn't about the external appearances for first and foremost. Maybe your understanding of being a woman will give rise to some parts of that, but when you go like, am I being a good woman? It can't come down to how you look in the mirror. For me, it's been really helpful to be able to both see the range of examples of the saints, that you have women who were excellent mothers, women who lived a solitary life as consecrated virgins, and that somehow all of these women were good women. So what was it primarily that unites them when they live such different lives? When someone's starting from a secular point of view would never be able to pick all these women
Mhm.
out as having something in common. And I think a huge part of it is a real sense of prudence and attentiveness to the responsibilities in front of you in your particular life. And that means you can wind up in very different places while cultivating that same virtue of prudence, depending on what responsibilities are actually in front of you. I think the other thing that's been helpful for me is the nuptial metaphor of Christ and the church as giving us a sense of what marriage is. So it's not just who does more of the dishes, how do you guys, who makes more money, what you do with your bank account. Like the fundamental thing marriage is somehow resembling Christ and the church. And so it's larger and stranger than any one marriage, and I get to participate in it through mine.
Would you also say, like you do discuss a lot of things that are very practical, and I want to get to those policy suggestions, even on how we should consider care and the free care that we give, as mother, as spouses in a house. Um, But what I wanted to say is also like you talk about the pill and you talk about shrinking women, right? Women that, and even you talk about anorexic women that do not have their period anymore. And I think we live in a society where women either because of eating disorders or because they simply are on the pill, they do not menstruate and are therefore a lot less women. So would you also say that this it's a very bad signal? A woman making her own, examination of conscience should say, if I'm not okay with the way my body works, or if I'm doing something to make it stop working the way it should, I am already basically not being feminist.
Yeah, I think anytime you notice you have a contempt or horror for a part of the natural world or part of your natural body, it's something you have to sit with and say, okay, well, what is it that's repulsing me? Is it about my body? Is it about how other people are reacting in a cruel way to my body? And how can I live a fully integrated life so that I never feel like my body is something I have or something that's happening to me, but that it is truly me?
Okay, and so should men at the same time, how do we train them in that sense? Because I think my fear is this, like, I've read your book with delight, but I also wonder, are a bunch of generations trapped because we grew up with this idea of almost neutrality between the sexes, that we will never get used to the fact that we are intrinsically different? It's like, how do we retrain ourselves?
I think the good news is everyone runs into some evidence that there are big differences that merit accommodation and conversation, just like we do run into evidence that we are frail and dependent. Again, people run into different kind of shocks at different times, but I think there's a real sense of shame about acknowledging them. So that is part of why I put both feminist and dependence front and center on the book so that I'm trying to give people who are coming at it from a range of perspectives, of very interested in dignity and independence, not interested in feminism, or vice versa, a way of saying this is the spot where we meet in the middle, where there is space to talk about what's true, that there are asymmetries between men and women, and what it will mean to respond justly to them, which is something I trust actually everyone is interested in at a very deep level.
Would you say, for instance, it's not something you touch upon, but I think it would be helpful for the people listening, or like, how you describe this asymmetry? What's your take on paternity leave?
I'm in favor of it, though I think it would be reasonable for maternity leave to be longer. I think there's no reason to assume these should look equivalent for men and women when men don't need to physically recover from having a baby. Men don't receive the same benefit from being able to stay home and nurse their baby in the same way a woman does. But, sometimes I see people say, oh, what's the point of paternity leave? My wife would kick me out of the house after 2 weeks. I'm like, are you are you just telling me in public you're a bad husband? Because I would never do that. First of all, I've had some difficult deliveries where I deeply needed my husband, where it was hard for me to move around. I couldn't handle stairs. But also, we both love our baby. He's both taking care of me as I recover from a dinner plate sized wound inside my body, and he's getting to know our daughter or our son and has a real role to play as the father, not just as the employed person who's bringing home a paycheck. So I think it's really important to say that men always have a role in the home. They're not a recurring direct deposit. They also are a helpmeet to their wives and offer a particularly intimate and necessary kind of help after delivery. But women could have longer leave, yes.
And you just mentioned pain, and the pain you went through in your book. You describe how, necessary it was, especially the first weeks that your husband was there to help you. And you talk about how we do not tolerate pain in our society. So we're, an anesthetic society. We also, the result of the euthanasia movement, with the extremes, but like painkillers are a daily medication for a lot of people. We did read here at the Institute Dopamine Nation recently, which also, part of that book explains to the audience how beneficial it would be to feel some pain sometime, because that helps our dopamine levels to get higher right after, right? So this thing about pain, I think, is related, and I would like to hear what you think about this too. The fear that I've heard coming from young women who would tell me, even when they say that, they would consider having kids, although not so many want kids, at least that's what they say when they're very young, is that they're horrified by the pain of labor. Um, I've heard words, like horrible words used for what pregnancy is like. They use very bad words, and they would say, I'd rather adopt or use surrogacy to have my baby, because I don't want to go through the physical pain.
Yeah.
What do we do with that? How?
Well, you know, I'm someone who's had all of my kids with mostly natural childbirth. I'm not opposed to people getting epidurals, but I found a real gift in it. And then I had an emergency C-section, so kind of I only had an uncomplicated natural childbirth for my last baby. But part of what I learned by doing that is it changed my relationship a little bit to what I would say is just intense physical work. I'm not a big physical person in the other domains of my life. I lift weights occasionally. I don't like cardio. I'm never going to run a marathon ever, ever, ever in my whole life. And my job is working on family policy at my computer. So how much of my day is like deeply embodied? Mostly playing with my kids and cooking, I would say. And so I've always had, if not the kind of horror of pregnancy, I've just had a horror of athletics. And I couldn't imagine why someone would run a marathon. And I'd hear friends talk about it, it's like, oh, yeah, and then I was running, I got to the point where you kind of almost throw up. And I've been training. And, two of my toenails have fallen off. I'm like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Which I feel is the inverse reaction to how some might feel about me talking about laboring without epidurals. But for me, having a baby was the only time it ever made sense to me that someone would choose to run a marathon, because it was a painful experience. Parts of it were quite difficult, but it was never for me at any point a purely negative experience. What it was the feeling of for me, and this is partly informed by taking the Bradley approach to preparation for labor, is the feeling of my body doing something that was very hard excellently. And that is what runners, I'm told, feel like, where you're working at the edge of what your body can do, and you make it through and you're proud of what you've done. And you do have a sense of, wow, I'd do that again, even though an observer might go, are you crazy? I just watched you pass out, at the finish line. And that is how I felt having a baby. Each time I was like, I would do that again. Now, for me, the big dividing line isn't, is it ever a good thing to do something that's physically hard on your body as a form of excellence? Like, it's that when I do this having a baby, at the end, I get a baby. And when you do this for a marathon, you get a medal and a little metal blanket to stay warm. So, like, this is an easier sell for me. But it really gave me a sense of how is it wonderful to experience the range of what a body can do, even when it's hard.
Yeah, great. You said
Do you,
it so
do
well.
you do you run
I
at
don't
all?
e
Because I
no.
don't.
I
But
mean, I d
okay.
no, I do sometimes. I like fun exercise. I don't like just feeling pain for the sake of
Mhm.
pain. It's not my thing. I wouldn't do it for free. If they pay me, maybe. So I would need to be really excellent, like really good. Okay, now you say you work on family policy, and there's a lot in your book that has to do with policy, and I want to talk about that a little bit. You have a beautiful sentence at some point that is amateur care is the most fundamental type of care, and so when you talk about that, you talk about the free kind of care that we give to our parents when they're aging or to our children in their home, and you do underline how the system in which we live doesn't not only doesn't value that, and we I think we could talk about both things, right? How it doesn't value that on the one hand, and on the other hand, how it basically there's an incentive to outsource it. So
Yes.
why don't we talk about this?
There's an incentive to outsource it, partly, through the idea of, oh, this will make it containable or practicable or manageable. And there are times when that is what makes sense. There are very few families that have the resources to care for a strong parent with difficult dementia, where you may need to totally change your whole house, or you may need to be able to physically sedate your parent when they don't know what's going on, become agitated or violent. So I'm not against contracting out some care or outsourcing some care, but I think there's a tendency to assume that a lot of work is specialized or professional in a way that's not true. One of the ways I see this when people go after homeschooling, it's like, well, how could you homeschool? You don't have the expertise, ignoring that you can gain part of it and you can look at curricula, but knowing how to educate your kids is kind of core to being a parent, knowing what to choose, who to trust, whether you're enrolling them in school or not. And I see this really come out on the policy side, where there's a big push for credentialism in childcare of, well, maybe our state should mandate everyone working with young kids has a bachelor's, or maybe they should have a childhood learning degree specifically. And you see this justified on the grounds that, and then we'll be able to raise their salaries and pay them what they deserve. But you can raise their salaries just because the work is valuable and because they're doing a good job. The appeal to, we've got to require this degree is a kind of value laundering. We think this work is valuable. We're nervous about saying it's valuable. So we've got to find a way of saying we're employing more expensive people to prove it's valuable. I think that kind of does both parents and caregivers a disservice.
Absolutely. And I think I found it also, I mean, fascinating is probably not the right word, but like very interesting and sobering how for some parents, it's better to hire someone to do certain jobs because they would get money, some help. I think it's Medicaid that would subsidize some
Mhm.
things, but if you do it yourself as a parent, it doesn't. Could you?
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of just very baroque rules of, well, you can get paid as a caregiver when you're doing the following medical things, but when you carry them to the next room, you're not doing those. It's just the rules of you're clocking in as a caregiver, oh, you're just being a parent now are very weird. And I think there's no one who feels like they reflect a real distinction for a parent who is also providing medical care for their child. And then on the other side, you see for SSI, this is the form of disability that's given to people who don't have a very long work history. So it's a little stingier than SSDI, which is disability if you have a longer work history. But it also has this very weird feature where you're supposed to deduct any help you get from friends or family from your government benefits. So if you get a certain amount of money per month and I have you over for dinner, or I drop off some groceries for you. I'm like, oh, I'm going grocery shopping. I'm going to bring over some pasta and sauce for you so that you don't have to run to the groceries. You don't have to pay me back. We're buddies. You need to get the receipt from me and send it to the government to say, please pay me $8 less this month because a friend of mine gave me some groceries. And I think that's really treating all non-professional, non-bureaucratized help as though it's stealing from the government to care for someone, or it's some other way suspect. And it really, as you can tell, ticks me off.
Yeah, and it was sobering for me to read it. I would say one thing that I really liked, maybe I liked it also because I'm Italian and I do this all the time with my friends, is when you said that you're talking about how friends, like to pay each other back immediately for like, say I pay for dinner, I'm gonna Venmo you because you paid my dinner. And instead you made this agreement with a friend of like, no, next time I pay this time and you're gonna pay the next one. And this I think helped you talk about that network of dependence we have if we live in a community. And I think this is something I grew up with, which, it also helps you understand who are friends and who are not. Because like, well, if you pretend you forget
Mhm.
next time, it's like, okay, that says a lot about you. But yeah, what would you say more about that? And I like, yeah, what that means for you.
Yeah, I think that really comes down to the idea of there are ways we interact with strangers that are meant to allow them to remain strangers. If I go buy a book, and I'm traveling in a different city, I pay them money, they hand me the book, I can't write them an IOU. They know they won't see me again. They don't know if I'm good for it, if I'm scamming them. If I went to my local coffee shop further along the spectrum and I forgot my wallet, I bet my local coffee shop would pour me the cup of coffee anyway because they see me a lot. They know they'll see me again unless I'm moving today, and I'm good for it. So there's this kind of difference between how you treat someone who's a stranger you want to remain a stranger, where there's no trust, no repeatability, nothing left over, and how you treat someone you're embedded in a community with. And what I loved was from David Graeber's Debt, he talks about an anthropologist staying with a group of people who never really paid each other back exactly. If I gave you a chicken, you don't give me a chicken back. You might give me like plantains, because if there's an exact equivalence between what you give me and what I return to you, it implies we're now ready to part as strangers. That's how you treat strangers. But if there's this always we know one of us owes the other, you gave me a chicken, did I give you slightly more than a chicken's worth of plantains or slightly less than a chicken's worth of plantains? It'll even out in the long run. And I think that sense of you want to always have a little debt owing on one side or the other on a real friendship because it'll even out in the long run. You're not concerned with, can we settle up? Can we part as strangers today? Obviously, I'll see you next week and one of us will ask the other for a favor again then too.
Yeah. I think, what strikes me is that in the States, and especially in big cities, this creation of community, which you dedicated your second book to that this thing, always needs to be intentional, right? It's not something you're born into and you just find. you need to be intentional. So I think that part of the suggestion that, your book gives, or I hope the start gives to some of the friends, is that this is not just gonna naturally happen. You kind of need to force, and sit with your friends and say, should we start living more like a community and trying to be a little more dependent on each other without being afraid of this. Now, talking about the fear of dependence, I mean, even the word, right? The dignity, you talk about the dignity of dependence because you're talking to people that probably detest the word dependence, right? Like, we want to be autonomous, this unencumbered self that can change his sex and look and nationality and, location and work and career and hair color, like, all the time, right? This is the modern image we have of the person. Do you think that part of this fear of dependence also comes? I mean, I'm thinking here, especially maybe for women, the way a woman becomes dependent is different from the way a man is dependent. And you can say more about that. But I was wondering how much that might be related to the background, their family background, right? So,
Well, I'd say
yeah.
I'd say first of all, some of this is very parallel to the issue we were talking about before of it's good to have all male spaces, but if you've had broken trust about them, then you're not enthused to see them spring back up again. Part of what gives people a horror of dependence is just seeing how we treat people who are dependent. And so if you see people, you know, speak unpleasantly of the elderly, say like, oh, she's not really herself anymore. It's really a shame. Like, I hope things come to an end soon and you're on the cusp of considering having a baby, it's not the same form of dependence, but you've learned something about how the people around you think about physical frailty, periods of intense need. You learn something from our laws, which say that it is specifically the dependence of a baby in a womb that makes it licit to kill them, and which now increasingly says the same thing about the elderly. So I think a great deal of that horror of dependence just comes out of the fact that our laws in our society say it is worse to be this kind of person. And if you are this kind of person, it is reasonable for people to want to walk away from you or even to end your life. And that means that even in smaller instances of dependence, you have this real sense of, I'm becoming a failure too. And you get it from the culture.
Yeah, I have corrected more than one friend saying, I don't ever want to become a burden. And, my way of correcting them is like, well, that's when you know that people love you. It's like, it's exactly when you're sick. Now, we think of burden as like, and I think we're so often a burden. Like, we way more often than we think. Like, but our friends know, that we have that bad day, or like, yeah, we're gonna repeat something with that. Like, it's an illusion. The idea that maybe we do live in the illusion that we're constant pleasure to other people and that they just, can't wait to be around us. But yeah, would you agree that that's something we should erase from everyone's vocabulary, like this
Y-
fear of being a burden?
Well, I think it's important to say you don't need to fear being a burden and you will be a burden. Because sometimes the pushback I get is like, well, you talk about people being a burden, but of course no one is a burden. I'm like, well, that's obviously untrue. And the more you reassure your friends that way, we're like, oh, I hope I'm not burdening you. You go, of course you're not burdening me, rather than this is a burden I'm willing to bear because I love you. The more you focus on, I would never think of you as a burden, the more you're secretly saying, even when you don't mean to, because of course a burden is the worst possible thing you could be. And it would be a strain on our friendship if you were one.
Yeah. Well said. Very well said. Yeah, thank you. I couldn't have done any better than this. So, talking about the feminisms out there, because your Substack is called Other Feminisms. Would you, like, as of today, not, not going back, I don't want the history of feminism, but as of today, both for men and women as a reference, right? Like, what are the feminisms out there? And where do you place yourself in your book in this?
Okay, well, they've gotten very messy, so I'll kind of
Mm.
give, one of the most basic divisions first, which is there is right now a big division between whether you think women exist in a very real and meaningful embodied sense or not, right? And this is kind of the divide between, you know, a feminism that's focused on what does it mean to be a woman with the assumption there is such a thing, a definite thing, and it's rooted in biology, versus the kind of trans expansive, gender queer, people have genders that they discover in various ways, but kind of frames gender as more a matter of expressive individualism. I think that's a pretty big cleavage, and it's very hard to have a feminism without an actual articulation of women, which that side doesn't have. So you get a strong sense of which side I'm on that question. But then I think one of the other big cleavages where I'm clearly in the minority and not in the mainstream part of feminism is about where this interest in autonomy and equality takes you. The focus on abortion as kind of I would say, central feature of mainstream feminism really starts from the assumption that women need this to be treated fairly, that women will not be treated fairly if we can be pregnant and not have the ability to say no to the baby. And what I think is really interesting is you go back a bit before Roe v. Wade, Ruth Bader Ginsburg always thought that the best constitutional case for abortion access was not privacy, which was a kind of weird appeal to an unclear right, but was due process protections and equal protection under the law. She was concerned that women could not be treated as legally equal unless they were functionally equivalent to men in certain ways. And because any man can walk away from a baby he fathers, women needed that same ability. Now, I think, Erica Bacchiacchi has done a good job describing this as an equality of vice, that men have this physical capacity for cowardice. It doesn't ask as much of them to abandon someone. So we have to give women the physical tools, which are violent tools, to abandon someone when men can just do it by running away. Ginsburg obviously wouldn't take that approach, but I think, even she really framed this as because men can do this, women must be given the tools to do it as well. And where I diverge pretty strongly is I think Ginsburg is descriptively correct. That is the expectation our society puts on women. I think it's an expectation we can't justly accommodate. And the question is, how do we build a society that does not say the entry price to society for women must be paid in children's blood? And how do we raise our expectations of men as well?
And what do you think that the way to raise expectation on men, the president of the Austin is Mark Regnerus, and was it at this point 15 years ago, he came up with the idea that there was a market, the Cheap Sex, the book, right? A market for sex, and women once upon a time were smart enough to, they would get men, they would marry them and, keep the children and be good fathers because they would be chaste or, if not until marriage, kind of. But that was the expectation, right? So a man knew that in order to have a wife and in order to be a father, in order to have a family, he needed to behave in a certain way. So the women were basically like the women set the bar. Now, do you agree? Is this still the right read? Because I have the impression that, women might be afraid of this dependence because of things they've seen or like because, society seems to be shaped in a way that doesn't accommodate their bodies. But I'm thinking that for men instead, it's not that they're afraid of dependence, it's that they basically do not see the need right now.
Well, I think that is always a challenge. When you're not going to be physically exposed to the risks of pregnancy, you can go longer without kind of being caught out as a non-autonomous person. And I think smaller families play a role in this as well. The larger your family, the greater the odds that someone in your own immediate family or someone among your cousins or your aunts or uncles will have a serious disease or disability early in life that brings home to you, actually, my strength is not a promise I can count on my whole life. And it can't be the only thing I root my identity in, or I will be in the position of my cousin, so and so, who thought what he was purely his strength and lost it and had to figure out who he is at his core. So I think those things cut away at it. But, you know, I think the Lysistrata strategy is still, a solid place to start, that women shouldn't have sex with men who are bad people, or haven't grown into being good people. That's a good place to start. But I think the power of that strategy has waned with the explosion of online pornography and now, the increasing expansion of AI girlfriends and customized, nude images, etc., that take men further and further away from seeking validation from actual women.
Yeah, and I don't know if you would agree with me, but I think what you say rings very true that, we are anesthetized, we don't feel pain. We it takes might take a very long time to see that someone needs something. And I'm seeing all this talk about assisted dying or like, get out of the picture. You don't see sick people. I did write it some years ago, and Professor Ignier was like, he corrected. It was like, no, there's a lot of elderly around. I don't see them, honestly. I don't see sick people in church. I don't see people walking with a stick. I don't see people with, and I am thinking that, all this politics that tries to push, to give you the autonomy to choose that you're going to say, this is enough. I don't want to suffer anymore. I'm going to exit life now. It's just going to it's going to it keeps feeding this myth that we exist as strong and independent. And not only that, what gives me pain is that admitting our need is seen as a sign of weakness when it's just a sign of humanity.
Yes. And I think that's really the big place where anyone can start, which is you can start pushing back against this expectation by asking for help more. And I do always say, I mean asking for help, not just offering it, though you can offer it. I'm not against that, obviously. But it's asking for help that gives a real witness to your friends or family or coworkers that you think that's a normal thing to do. And what I found is that when you offer to help other people, you won't always get people taking you up. You're like, "Is there anything I can help you with?" "Oh, no, I'm good. I'm fine." When you ask for help, um, it really means that not only do they get the chance to help you, but when they're in trouble, they look around and go, "Who at this office could I ask for help? My kid I got a call from urgent care. I've got to leave. I need someone to step into this meeting. Who could I ask?" Leah. Leah thinks you're allowed to just do that, to ask for help from someone without a clear way to pay it back or without, owing something to them already. I'll ask her. And I think kind of laying those foundations where you just testify that asking for help is a thing that happens across most forms of relationship means that you're surrounded by people who need help every day, but they're trying to find other ways to solve those problems rather than turning to the most natural people who could help them if they have no expectation those people think it's normal to ask for help.
You should have a t-shirt. No, I'm thinking of the t-shirt. There are some people that dance around town and it's like, ask me to dance. It's like,
Mhm.
let me, ask me for help. Like
Mhm.
something, t-shirts
Yeah.
that say, you can come to me, like do it. Maybe we could start a new brand with that. What do I want to say? Well, I do want to tell everyone that is listening and the friends of those listening that they should buy your book and read it because it's excellent. And there is this moving letter, the anecdote, I think it was a veteran, right, that needs
Yeah.
to he asks for help, and it's the first time he does it, or he's ashamed of having it to ask for help.
Yeah, he's trying to visit his wife. He's a wife in assisted living. He visits her every day, sits with her, holds her hands, but he gets a big snowstorm and he can't dig out of his driveway by himself. And he really tries, till he's blistered. And then he finally, at that point, posts on his neighborhood Facebook wall, that he needs help to get out of his driveway to see his wife. But he says he's ashamed to be asking. And he's someone who's a veteran who in many ways, made a gift of his strength to others, right? By enlisting, by his relationship with his wife. And what really kills me is if he loved his wife less, he would never have needed help because his strength actually would be sufficient. If he lived alone, if he didn't have anywhere to be, he could wait for the plows. He could dig out over a couple of days. The reason he becomes vulnerable and needs other people's help is because he loves her so much that he doesn't want to wait to see her. But in the moment, that's not what he sees. He doesn't see the magnitude of love is such that it becomes larger than what he can sustain. He just sees, I'm failing my wife, I'm failing as a man because other people have to take me out. And it was a lot of snow. It takes a bunch of people to take him out. I don't think a single one of them showing up thinks, wow, what a loser. The
Yeah.
hope is that we can live lives where we love as deeply, that we really are willing to love beyond what we can keep as a promise, what we can do, what we can say, I will always be there because I'll always have the power to be there versus, well, if I'm always there, it'll be because I was unafraid to ask for help in getting there.
Yeah. Wow. Beautiful story, that one. You collect a bunch of beautiful story, beautiful anecdotes, beautiful quotes. There's a lot of studies and numbers, very interesting analysis of like, I know something I didn't know that airbags were designed on men's bodies. So it's a lot
Mhm.
more likely that a woman would die in a car accident when the airbag comes out than a man. Things like that. I think interesting facts that might, even tell us maybe society was very feminized in some ways, but very under feminized in too many others. Before I let you go, because I know that your kids will be up early as all kids do.
Yeah.
What what I want to say is, what did I leave out that you do not want to,
You know,
that should be said, something that should be said still.
I think the biggest thing that I'd want to leave people with that we didn't talk about yet is when we think about what we want to do for men here, right? I think it's really about looking into how we make a gift of self. What's the paradigmatic way that men and women tend to do that? Not every woman will have kids, but every woman knows it's a possibility. And so there's a big way in which we tend to give our bodies to others um, by being there, right? In a way you can't, as Ginsburg noted, walk away from. That a lot of the hardest parts of pregnancy or even, of being with kids is a moment where I have no choice but to be there. I am nauseated, but I can do nothing about it. I have to decide how to receive this moment. Men have some moments that are like that too, just like women who don't have babies do, where the way you make a gift is how you respond to something you can't unchoose. But much more often, the way that men make a gift of self is by choosing to run towards something. And I think that's where you have to really pay attention to whether we're leaving enough doors open or enough invitations for men to use their strength for others. And I'd say think about even just where you contract out help for something that's physically hard versus ask someone in your community whether they can help you. Because the more that we rely on strangers, paid strangers, to help us navigate that which is too heavy, too long, too difficult, the more we are closing down some of those natural ways that men say, I'm bigger than other folks, I'm stronger than other folks. Well, what is all of this for? And the answer is it's for your neighbor. But that makes men differently vulnerable. They need that neighbor to be willing to call them. And I think we don't do a good enough job of saying we need each other in this way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think there should be, I would love to talk more. We're reading now with a reading group, we're reading Louise Perry on one end, but we're also reading Anthony Esolen, No Apologies book. And I think, he makes great points that are basically mirror yours, and I love them. And he talks about this agency and the need for men to act and act in particular ways. At the same time, I think we are in this delicate environment where things could be taken too far and where anything that seems to talk about one of the sexes seems to like disparage the other. And I hope nothing of what we said about feminism here sounds like that. I don't think it would, because we're just saying we're different and let's try to honor these differences. So this thing about the men needing this kind of action, I would also say, how about their rejection of fatherhood? Because we talk a lot about women wanting abortions and right, not wanting, not wanting pregnancies. Like I, I haven't met that many young men that say I want to have 8 kids. So do you have an understanding of why that? Because I think you do talk about this, right? That there is somehow the idea, like the young people in high school report, like I would not make a good spouse, I would not make a good father. Is that because we have kind of like elevated marriage to this impossible ideal, or
I'm really curious about that. I've been really disturbed by watching those numbers fall off a cliff for men and women, and I'm not sure what's driving it. But one of the things I'm curious about is, do these young people see multiple examples of good fathers and mothers in their community and in their lives? And I put an emphasis on multiple because I think even when you come from a good, stable family, it can create a sense of, okay, I know what it means to be a good husband. It means to be my dad specifically. And am I capable of being that exact guy? One thing I love about living in a neighborhood with a lot of families as I parent kids who are getting bigger is I get to kind of cheat off a lot of people's papers. And just like with the examples of the saints, where there's a lot of diversity among them, I can name a number of families I think are all successful, faithful, good parents who take different approaches to discipline or to how messy their house should be. And it gives me a sense of freedom of the range of being a good parent is wider than I might expect. And I now need to figure out what works for my family, not, well, here's the single narrow ideal. Can I clear it or not?
okay, last thing and then I let you go. How did fatherhood change your husband?
Ooh, well, in some ways, he had a lot of the best qualities already because he's a big brother to much younger siblings in some cases. And I think, from our third or fourth date, the way I heard him talk about his siblings made me sure he'd be a good dad because he had such a pride in them and wanted to see how they'd grow up and protective of them. And I'm like, well, you should do that for babies, right? I think the biggest thing that's different of he'd spent a lot of time trying on responsibility as a brother, as a director, where you have to take care of a whole cast who can be more emotionally fragile than children in some cases, right? Where things rest on his shoulders and he's willing to embrace that. But I think what's different about being a father than kind of trying any of those other responsibilities is, it really does all come down to you. So it's this real sense of awe, I would say, that's bigger than some of the other relationships of this tiny person, depends on us to keep them alive. And he's always been a responsible, generous person. And I think God has really responded to that by giving him a much deeper responsibility, but he prepared for it every day of his life until the day our first baby was born.
Wonderful. You have 3, right?
We've got 3 so far.
2 boy no. What's the
2 girls, 1 boy.
Okay, well, so you will see, how your theories and thoughts
Mhm.
will, influence the way they grow up. For now, I really want to thank you, Leah, for being with us. Again, I had invited you to come to Austin whenever you will be able to. We will be very happy to have you here in person. Keep writing, keep working on policy, and thank you again for being on our show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you to all our listeners. If you like this episode, please share it, subscribe to our podcast, and of course, if you're in Austin, check out our events and show up at the Austin Institute.